Dan Rubenstein, you see this shirt I'm wearing?
USA?
Good old US of A, man. 2-0 over Bolivia. Game 1 of the Copa America on Sunday evening. Felt really good. Yeah.
Nice.
Really good. This is a college football show, mind you, but got to support the team here on the podcast. I'm Ty. He's Dan. Welcome back.
Where'd they play the game? Was it AT&T?
Played the game in Arlington, yeah. AT&T Stadium.
That's college football-ish. There have been national championships in that stadium.
There have?
I heard. I mean, apparently the Ohio State-Oregon one from early 2015, I imagined it. Apparently it didn't happen.
Correct.
So that's
correct.
Good. Yeah.
And they got the turf sorted. I believe the first game that they played there, the turf was not like they just rolled it in off the truck a few days before they started playing.
Great.
And so the roots didn't, I don't know if you've ever had sod, but you know, like the roots got to like anchor. Otherwise,
got to take hold. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seemed like that was a little bit better and there weren't any injuries or anything to speak of. So,
hey, sorry for the quick interruption, but it'd be incredible if you considered subscribing to the Solid Verbal YouTube channel right down below.
Good news on that front. Good news on this front. Hey, we get to talk college football. Welcome welcome all. Thank you for tuning back into the show. Hit follow, hit subscribe, wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you are a super verballer or just want to support what Dan and I do, go on over to verballers.com. Just mosey on over, check out what we have to offer. We've been deep in the lab trying to put together some of our in-season benefit tiers, which at some point, probably towards the latter half of July, early part of August, we'll flip on and you'll see what we've got in store for all y'all this coming 2024 college football season, Dan.
Yeah.
In the meantime, though, we're gearing up to do previews, which is going to happen next month in the good month of July, at some point after July 4th. Stay tuned for that. In the interim, though, you made a really interesting comment to me, and I was hoping maybe you could expand on it a little bit.
Okay.
You and I are both in this unique situation where people ask us when we're out and about, like, what do you do? What is it that you do? And I think over the years, we've found new and inventive ways to mention that we do the podcast thing without being like too over the top about doing the podcast thing.
Yeah.
But inevitably, when it comes time to talk about college football, we find ourselves getting the same questions about the state of affairs in 2024. Yes. There's been a lot of change over the last couple seasons. And so naturally, not everybody follows it as closely as you or I or the people listening to this at home. We tend to get a lot of the same questions. What does it mean, Dan? What does all this mean? What are your thoughts on where things are headed? There's a lot of doomsday scenarios floating around out there. And so hopefully today, well, you can expand a little bit more on your thought process here, but hopefully today we can go through that thought experiment and talk it out in front of the verballerhood.
I'll add the first thing that people ask me when they find out what we do for a living is, yeah, but what about June? Like, you do like once a month in the off season or once a week. I'm like, no.
Right.
No, what do you talk about? Like, well, sometimes it's tricky. But in this specific instance, every time I have a conversation about college football, especially around now, April, May, June, this year specifically, it's, well, I guess you got like portal stuff to talk about and NIL and realignment's new and, 12-team playoff and that's going to 14 teams. And inevitably people come to some sort of solution, not some sort of conclusion, that like, man, one of those things would be a lot to deal with. 3, 4, 5 things at the same time? I don't know. And then like, people will, on the other side, like, oh, new matchups with realignment. That's kind of interesting and cool. And like, well, guys moving around the sport, I guess, it's really good for the players in a lot of instances, but it's tough in this regard. Like, there is like a pros and cons push and pull to all of the changes in the sport. And, you see it online, you see it in conversations you have with people in real life that faces darken. Moods darken is probably the better way to put it, that you're just like, it's just going to be, I guess I'll just watch Illinois, right? If I'm talking to, which I do, my friend Brian this past weekend, or like, I guess I'll just, I'll watch USC games and it's kind of interesting, or I'll watch, Texas Tech games, or like, I just wait and see how we like it. But man, that's a lot new. And you do get that like doomerism with the future of the sport. And I don't like to write off somebody's viewpoint without thinking about it and talking it through. And so that's what I wanted to do with you, because I love so many more aspects of this sport than I am worried about, even still with all of the changes. But I want to see if we can get to some sort of interesting place with, if something new is stupid, if it's not stupid, if it's slightly stupid. Shout out to the band Slightly Stupid, legendary in the Southern California scene. Or if it's not, if it's actually like legit good. And so I want to sort of have this powwow. This is our Davos, Ty. This is our G7, whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
Ahead of like preview season starts soon, and we've been, looking at certain teams with their outlooks and whether they can hit ceilings and stuff. But I don't know. I think this is an important conversation.
And on top of that, look, we did the June 2-part Q&A episode a couple weeks ago now.
Yeah.
And you'll remember the question we got from one of our Patreon footballers about where are you at from a motivation standpoint with all these changes? Because it is a lot, right? It doesn't matter what thing you're talking about. This many structural changes all at once is a lot. It's a lot to try and understand and compute. And for people who aren't in this the way you and I are, some of the conversations I've had with people, they just outright forgot about some of the stuff that's gone on this offseason.
Totally. Completely true.
And I think that's totally normal. I don't expect that everybody is a sicko like you and I, or doing this for a living like you and I. And so it is a necessary dose of reality that I think brings us to this point. And the more to the point that I was making a second ago, the question that we got about are you more or less motivated given all the changes has really been bounced around in my head. It's really been bounced around in my head. And I remember that question. Shout out HCB, who is the name of the gentleman that asked it. It bounces around in my head every single time I have a conversation like the one you just described.
Right.
Because I can't tell right away if somebody is more or less motivated to watch the sport. So we're not going to pump sunshine as much today as just, I think, have a conversation.
Sure.
With respect to how we're feeling about this. And we're not going to tell you how to feel, but if we can help inform you one way or another, that's, I think, a goal for us here.
I agree. Where do you want to start?
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking of some of the conversations I've had with folks, and I think inevitably it is the expanded playoff that comes up first.
By the way, I love when you turn into Senator Ty and call people folks.
Folks.
I talked to folks across this great state, and they're all saying the same thing.
I did
they're
give a
tired of blah blah blah.
I gave a State of the Union address. You know this.
I know. I love Senator Ty,
Back in
and I
March.
say that genuinely.
The expanded playoff.
Sure.
The expanded playoff is the one that comes up most frequently for me. I suspect the Oregon thing to the Big Ten is what comes up most frequently for you. Is that accurate?
Yeah, Big Ten expansion in general, because this is where I am in the Chicago burbs. Yeah.
What are people saying about the Big Ten expansion in your neck of the woods? What is kind of the sentiment among those folks? There it is.
They say the same thing. They say, oh, that's right. Weird. Like they are reminded that there are going to be 4 new teams in the Big Ten. And then in addition, like also SEC, ACC, and Big 12 are also shifting things around. Not to mention G5 conferences are new look every year, it seems. And so that's the first reaction. That's right. Weird, but kind of cool. And this is when I say like, yeah, I can kind of drive to a bunch of Oregon games if I really wanted to. And so that's generally the feeling. It's not passing judgment on like, oh, it's going to be so much harder, or we're going to have it so much harder, going out to the West Coast. It's more just like weird still. And the season starts in like 2 months, something like that. So that's the reaction I get. And I am, very much on record saying that the death of West Coast football in that, grouping all those major programs out west and west-ish is a tragedy for the sport. So that to me is just like extremely stupid that the sport, the region, whatever, couldn't get it figured out. There are a number of factors why they couldn't. But in terms of realignment and if this will doom the sport, I say likely not. Likely not, because the only thing that the sport has is a full history of constant change. And so this is not going to last. Maybe there will be more teams in a bunch of conferences. Maybe things will split up and make a little bit more sense regionally. But I don't get the sense in speaking to people online, in real life, wherever, that they're convinced that because the Big Ten is adding teams, the SEC is adding teams, maybe there's probably more rightful doomerism among ACC people, given that, two of the powers in Florida State and Clemson are trying to get out. But I don't get the sense that people's habits with their fandom and the sport are going to shift dramatically. And on the same token, you do get that conversation like, oh, we get new, interesting, big matchups potentially when, Wisconsin, USC face each other, Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, Washington, if and when Washington, pops back up to national power status. Like that to me is a positive spin that I think a lot of people have.
I actually think that's my spin too.
Okay.
I think that's my spin. I think that's how generally I feel about this. We unfortunately, given our large audience, still do not have enough sway to prevent college football and the business minds behind it from killing off one whole traditional conference, the Pac-12.
Mm-hmm.
We would have saved it if we could have, but that is clearly not in our pay grade. But as things stand, I don't see a whole lot from a realignment standpoint that is going to, you mentioned the word habit, that is going to change my habits. And that was going to be my next question for you. What would it take to change those habits and to make people feel differently about it? Because I say that, again, mindful of the fact that I know I've had conversations over the last 6 months with people who genuinely don't remember that any of this happened.
Yep.
And that doesn't make them any less of a fan. It's just a lot to try and keep track of, especially over the last 24 months or so.
Sure.
And so I've often wondered, what would it take to really wake up, sheeple? What are we doing here? What is it going to take for you to break that habit or to feel differently, truly feel differently about this sport just within the context of conference realignment? Because right now it doesn't feel like it makes sense. It doesn't feel like it makes sense.
It's not fully real yet because we haven't started the season and we've had realignment over the course of the past, 15 years or so in major conferences. But to this degree, dramatic with the size of programs that are moving around, it's not real until it's, Texas, Georgia as a conference game. It's not real until it's USC, Maryland or whatever as a conference game. That's when it becomes a conversation.
I think the vast majority of people who follow college football will look at the schedule on a week-to-week basis, and they will see more big games, and they will view it more as a television product, the way you have described for eons on this show. For as long as I have known you, you've talked about college football as an entertainment product and a TV show. Not necessarily because you want that to be the case, but that is the reality in which we have found ourselves with the sport over the last 15 years. It's going more in that direction. So I think most people will come at it from that standpoint. There will be some nostalgia. Certainly if you're an Oregon State, if you're a Washington State fan, if you're a school like a Stanford or a Cal or who knows, whoever else that is going to be horribly displaced and not necessarily rewarded financially for it. I understand coming at this from a different perspective, but I think the vast majority of the people who listen to our show who have rooted for some of those power teams are going to look at the schedule on a Saturday and be like, oh, cool. I like these games. There are more good games to pick from. That being said, we also have a lot of folks, Senator Ty at it again.
Senator Ty.
Who appreciate the value and appreciate the competitiveness and the playoff and everything that goes along with the Power Four, but also their first rooting preference is a G5 school.
Sure.
They like the G5 schools. Now, thankfully, with the expanded playoff, they've given a golden ticket to some G5 team to get in every year. Maybe there will be years where there's two. I doubt it. Unless there is some incredible force of the universe working in favor of the G5. They will probably, Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey will probably try to limit their access as much as humanly possible. That's just reality.
Yeah.
That said, though, I do wonder how those fans feel. And I feel like from their standpoint, it's less about the realignment and more about the sensation that the gap between the haves and the have-nots has widened further and shows no signs of decelerating anytime soon. That, I think, is like the true, what was the doom word you used before?
What, doomerism?
Doomerism. That's the doomerism in this argument.
Sure.
The doomerism in this argument is not necessarily if you root for Oregon, Ohio State, Texas, most of the schools we talk about on a week-to-week basis. The doomerism is if you're an Ohio fan, if you're a
Tulane
fan. Like Tulane might not even be the best example, but if you root for one of those G5 schools, I think it's hard to look at this and not feel like you're slowly being shouldered out of the conversation.
I think there's going to be a lot of shouldering. I think you can look at every single tier within the sport, every single tier within every conference, and if you are adding, say what you will, Texas, Oklahoma, say what you will about, the LA schools, Washington, Oregon, you are adding quality to the major conferences. You are adding, depending on how you feel about SMU, Stanford, and Cal, you're adding at, usually okay programs. So I think it's just expanding what already exists in the ACC in the middle. The Big 12 is adding quality programs in the Arizona schools and Utah, Colorado, TBD. But what I think people, when they think, okay, we're going to have more interesting matchups, adding these teams to our conference, the teams that perhaps are used to being in that 6-6, 7-5-ish range are not going to be super keen on, we've added quality teams. Now we're going 4-8 more often than we. So I think you talk about being shouldered out. Some of the fans of those teams that are, used to competing for bowl spots or whatever. Like, I think that the tenor of a lot of teams' seasons and program health is going to change and pretty quickly. I also think one of the things you mentioned is true, though, with the more interesting matchups, it's the novelty is going to wear off. And as novel as everything that's happening in the sport, whether it's expansion, portal, whatever, the fact that Wisconsin is going to play Washington or Texas is going to play South Carolina or whatever, it's going to wear off. People are just going to get used to the reality. And we had the novelty of a 14 playoff, and like interest and ratings and conversation just slowly declined over time. As maybe that's a product of the same teams playing against each other when you had like the Alabama Clemson stretch or Georgia playing for it a couple years in a row. That I think college football fans in general, basically impossible to paint with a wide swath and a large brush, but like, we as a community appreciate new. We like upsets. We like, a bunch of different things that we're not used to seeing. And we're just going to get used to seeing a new look SEC. We're going to get used to seeing a new look Big Ten. And the novelty of new matchups just becomes matchups. And I wonder how quickly that happens.
Well, the novelty of new teams and new places is something that will be there this year and probably next. And sure. I think that part of it will wear off quickly. I disagree that the good matchup side of that is going to wear off.
Okay.
Because these are games on campus. Maybe the stuff that happens during the playoffs in the expanded playoff field and playing those games on neutral sites, maybe that will become old hat sooner than later, because there is part of that feels very corporate. But there's nothing like a big-time college football matchup on a Sunday in September on a sprawling campus that's loud as hell. It doesn't matter what those two teams are. That part has never gotten old in the history of college football. So I disagree from that standpoint. However, there are certainly aspects of this that I think right now everything is kind of shiny and new, and maybe you hate it and maybe you don't, but it's very easy to look at everything as if it's like the biggest novelty in the sport.
Well, okay. What would you consider to be, generically speaking, a big-time matchup? Top 15? Top 20? Certainly you have to see numbers next to each school in the TV graphic.
Yeah, I'd say top 25. Two top 25 matchups. That's usually the lens through which I am looking at what I'd consider a big game when we put together our show docs during the season. Yeah, top 25 matchup.
Okay. So, but you're also thinking like it's top 25, but hopefully between two more recognizable brands, right?
Recognizable brands, yeah.
Right. You'll have a top 25 Michigan-Oregon game. You'll have a top 25 Oklahoma-LSU game or something like that.
Sure.
And seeing those two schools next to each other, and it's 17 versus 9. What I wonder is, I suspect, and I know this from experience and from a little bit of guessing, that like the way people consume the sport is, one, they have to watch their team's game. And then two, depending on what time it's kicking off, they'll watch what they perceive to be the biggest national game of the weekend. That not everybody has, 4 screens going at the same time. Not everybody's watching from, noon to 1 a.m. or something like that. They view college football. If they're not only watching their team, they're watching their team. And if they happen to be around, a big game that kicks off at, 8 Eastern or something, or 3:30 Eastern if it's an SEC game. So what I wonder is, what does that mean when you have so many perceived big, new, interesting matchups, but people still have their lives?
Right. So what you're referring to is, in effect, does more equal more?
Right. That are you more likely to cancel your real life touching grass plans because number 21 Michigan State is playing number 23 UCLA? Right. Or number 9, number 7, number 15, number 11, whatever. I think there's a threshold that people are going to have to figure out. And ultimately what I think is it's going to not change. I think we have the novelty of a year or two, and then it's just, I am interested or I am not interested. And the fact that we have this realignment ultimately in the long term will not change my habits. That's what I think. And you're going to have more Big Ten and SEC teams. And this brings me to another point. So if the top 25 becomes more populated with Big Ten and SEC teams, which makes sense because these conferences are probably going to be the most respected because of their quality and depth, does that even further turn people against big Big Ten games and big SEC games? Because also what we get with adding Texas, Oklahoma, adding Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA is you're sort of muddying up the top of these conferences in terms of who middle tier teams or whoever is shooting for.
Right.
If you find out that Kansas State is up 10 on Texas in Austin with 11 minutes left or something, you're like, oh, we might have a spicy upset brewing because everybody's gunning. You have the narrative of everybody gunning for the top tier powers, for Pete Carroll's USC or Chip Kelly's Oregon or Nick Saban's Alabama. And then you start muddying what makes up that A tier team that you're gunning for. It makes it more difficult to sell, I think, on Saturdays sometimes. You're just well, LSU might be upset, but are they the best team in the SEC? Do I feel strong things about LSU because they've won the conference 4 years in a row and might lose to, Kentucky or something like that? I feel like there's going to be a muddied narrative shift when you don't have clear alphas. Alpha. I know you put alpha male next to your Twitter handle. That's the thing you do.
Always have to. Yeah.
But when you lose that clear storyline, is that not you? I was positive that was you.
Oh.
Maybe you just give off alpha male
Bunch
energy.
Of idiots. Keep going. I'm sorry.
No, my broader point is I think it'll be tougher with some teams, right? The Big Ten, Ohio State, and Michigan are still going to be there. We don't quite know what Oregon's going to do and how they're going to find themselves in the hierarchy of the Big Ten. Same for Texas and Oklahoma. But you lose Jim Harbaugh, you lose Nick Saban. And so I think it becomes more difficult to sort of figure out how you feel about watching certain games. Does that make sense?
Well, it does make sense. And you sort of tangentially brought up something that I was going to go to next. And I think it's a good segue for it. So I think one point about this that I am most interested in seeing develop over the next couple seasons is exactly what you described in passing. And that is, what will the sentiment be among hardcore, casual, hobbyist college football fans with respect to the Big Ten and the SEC? Because we have seen, we've been doing this for a long time now. We have seen, I think, a pretty drastic shift in public sentiment against the networks.
Yeah.
Against the likes of ESPN and Fox, because many folks, rightly or wrongly, believed that they were the powers behind changing college football in this way.
And ESPN more so than Fox, just because of their history with the sport and game day and the visibility of their personalities. Yeah, continue.
And so I wonder if, for a long time, it has been, you play an SEC team, you want to take out the SEC. I haven't felt quite that sentiment with respect to the Big Ten, with respect to really any other conference. It's just been the SEC because the SEC has almost branded itself as a cut above.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been the toughest conference, to their credit. I understand where that's coming from. But now in this new media landscape, where it is very clearly a two-horse race to be the alpha males of the college football conference alignment structure, whatever word we're using here, I feel like you're going to have more and more people out there who want to root against those guys. Unless your team plays in those conferences.
Mm-hmm.
Just some of what I've picked up, some of the notes from the kind folk around this great land, I have detected a real almost animus towards those two conferences in particular.
Of course.
And especially so after the news came out about, we're going to expand it to 14 now. Dennis Dodd was writing articles about how Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey are doing their best to try and assert some dominance here over the college football landscape. I think that will have a knock-on effect. I think it'll take a little bit of time for people to get there. But it wouldn't surprise me in time if people start hating on the Big Ten the way they have hated on the SEC for all these years.
Oh,
Because
I think we're already there.
Those
we're
are going to be
there.
the two conferences that have a target on their back for sure.
Well,
so, sort of a build on what you were saying, but I think that's where we're headed if we're not already there.
And the other thing is, and we've talked about this before, is the issue of scarcity, that like people are excited, and I think rightfully so, and I'm excited about this, like more good matchups, more quality matchups, because you're adding quality to a bunch of different conferences. But if the SEC or the Big Ten in particular, because of the size of those conferences and the teams that they're adding, if they're every week offering you a top 20 matchup, I mean, you don't celebrate your birthday every month, right? There is something fun about that. What we get to watch does not happen every week. You know, a top 5 matchup does not happen every week. A top 10 matchup does not happen every week. And so if you are offering somebody that 3 of those, 7 of those every week between a bunch of different conferences, and I don't know if math definitely does not bear that out, but if you're offering that to people more often, yes, in the short term, I believe people will be more excited about the new, novel, interesting matchups. But like, if you're weighing watching a big game at 3:30 Eastern versus meeting buddies somewhere, you know, to play golf or whatever, and you're like, well, this happens every week, so I can miss this number 17 versus number 13 matchup because I know next week when I turn on my TV, I'm just going to get Penn State, UCLA in the top 20 or something like that, because it's going to happen so much more often because those conferences are going to be, rightfully or wrongfully, respected in the polls a little bit more, that like those types of matchups will go from interesting and new to not especially special.
I hear you. Let me shift a little bit.
Yeah.
On the topic of having conversations with fans, I had a conversation this weekend with my 14-year-old nephew.
Nice.
Always a very weird stage in life when your nieces and nephews, or in some cases, your offspring, get old enough to have real conversations about sports.
Yeah.
They know just as much as you do. Really makes you feel old. It did on Saturday. But we had a conversation about the expanded playoff. And his question to me was, hey, what is new? What is going on? I've seen a lot about this. My friends have talked about it. What is new? And I mentioned the expanded playoff. And the reaction was, oh, that's cool. That's cool. I'm real curious to see a few years down the line if people still feel like that's a cool thing. Because you bring up the point of scarcity. Many have brought up the point about diluting the regular season, which has long been the crown jewel of college football. These games on campus, these big rivalries that make the sport tick, et cetera, et cetera. And also, I think with the conference realignment, with some of these conferences getting a lot stronger, it will have an effect on win-loss records. You will have a conversation at some point whether an 8-4 team belongs in the playoff. Not because their record's 8-4, but maybe because they play in the SEC and they played a brutal schedule.
Right.
The committee will take that into account. Maybe 9-3 becomes the new 10-2 for some of these programs that are used to winning a certain number of games, but now the schedule for everybody gets a little bit harder. Frankly, I don't know how that's going to go over. Now, I've said for years in this show, when the playoff is expanded. We knew it was going to expand. It was always a matter of when, not if. When the playoff expands, qualifying for the field, 12, 14, however many teams it ends up being, qualifying into the playoff will be the new threshold by which we measure coaching success. Not so much what you're doing during the regular season. That obviously has an effect as well. But are you making the playoff? And once you get there, are you able to win games or at least look competitive once you arrive? I think that is going to be the new measuring stick. And I'm curious if records look a little bit weaker than they have in the past. I'm curious with it being easier to get into the playoff, maybe with an 8-4. I don't know. Depends on the year. I'm curious with all of these factors now playing a pretty significant role in a way that we didn't see 5 years ago.
Yeah.
If that will affect people's perceptions of their own teams. If they will feel better about a 9-3 season. If it will be disappointing a 9-3 season. Knowing that the schedule is going to be harder, knowing that the pathway into the playoff, like you could play it both ways. You can get in the playoff and maybe have a worse record, whereas before you could have a great record and still not get it. It feels like they almost cancel out to me. I'm curious to see what kind of effect that has on the public.
Yeah, the conversation since the announcement of the expansion has been like, oh, more teams are going to be in it come November or whatever, right? That there's going to be 17 teams that like feel like they have a shot. What does that mean? I have no idea. I know that my gut says you may think 17 or 19 or 22 or 14 teams or whatever have a shot, but all things being equal, it's going to be the Big Ten team getting in. It's going to be the SEC team getting in.
Let me ask you a question on that point.
Yes.
You know the energy level around college football fandom.
Sure.
Every year, it's a cycle. We see it in downloads. We see it in questions. We see it in YouTube comments. It has been this way every year since we started doing this show. Everybody is undefeated in August and through a good chunk of September.
Mm-hmm.
But once teams start getting into their conference schedules, usually once you get into around the mid-October timeframe, that's when you start to see interest peter out a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that pattern is going to hold this season, knowing that more teams will be available come the start of November to potentially make that playoff?
Right.
Knowing that even if you're not maybe in that conversation, teams are going to have games against other playoff hopefuls that are meaningful for those fan bases.
Right.
Maybe your team at that point is, 4-6, but you're playing a team that's potentially looking to get into the playoff and you can play spoiler.
Right.
Do you think that the interest will stretch out deeper into the season among people who listen to this show, who watch the sport, because the playoff now has that wider pathway in, and because it certainly, at least to start, is a bit of a novelty given all the changes we've seen?
Okay, so I think interest this year, yes. Maybe next year, yes, once again. The interesting thing about more teams being in it late is fans of that number 19 team are still watching the games, right? They still have an incredible reason to watch, whether or not there's a 12-team playoff or not, right? If your team is 8-2 in November or whatever, and you are, the number 15 team or the number 9 team or whatever in the country, you're still watching those games because you're rooting for a good team and you're likely playing a rival at the end of the year. You're heading into the rivalry portion of the schedule. So you're not, the interest in your team is not going to change whether you are thinking that you have a chance to go to a 14-team playoff or a 12-team playoff. I think the people who lose interest in the sport as the season goes on are the ones when Mel Tucker gets fired at 1 a.m. and fewer Michigan State people suddenly care about the season, right? Where there's some sort of dramatic change. The starting quarterback, tears an ACL and it's just a bunch of freshmen and walk-ons. And you just have this sense that this is not going to end well. This season is going to be painful to watch. And so I am watching less game day. I'm listening to less of the solid verbal. I am, reading fewer things on The Athletic, whatever, that your just general consumption is going to change because you feel as if all hope is lost come late September or something. So I think there will be more interest in games that perhaps didn't have a lot of interest, that if you are the number 14 team and number 12 is playing and losing late and you feel like you can hop over or something like that. Yeah. I think you'll be more interested in games that perhaps in previous seasons you weren't interested in. But I still think this is a sport primarily defined by people rooting for their teams and catching other games if timing works out. Like, I think we overstate how many people are just like die-hard national college football fans that watch all day and care about a ton of teams and care about a ton of narratives.
Well, because those are our people, right?
These are our people, right? Yeah. And that's who I am. That's who I've been for a long time. And there's a lot of us out there. But in terms of general population, the way people watch the sport and care about the sport, yeah, if you've got a top 20 program that you root for, you're going to keep watching. And if you root for a program that is catastrophically bad, you might stop watching in October or November, and that's okay. Hope is lost, and you pick us up again next summer. That's how I generally feel, that like while more teams have hope, I don't know if it appreciably changes how many people truly care in November.
But yeah, and this is why we do the window of opportunity during the season.
Of course.
Because not everybody is us. We have a lot of different levels of fandom that pass through these gates here.
Yeah.
On a given year. And we're trying to speak to all of those bases. I'm curious though. This is sort of my question du jour for the Verballerhood. If you want to write in or hit us up on socials, or if you're in our Discord at verballers.com, I'm curious to get your sense for whether or not the interest level will be as high late in the season or higher at the end of this season than it's been in the past for you.
I think this season, yeah. I know you're asking other people for their opinion, but I'm here.
If you root for a team like a Purdue or, and not to throw Purdue, but Pitt, some teams that probably will not be in the playoff conversation, but certainly will have an opportunity to play big games down the stretch.
Right.
I'm just wondering if this, at least initially, is something of a rising tide that lifts all the boats.
Yeah, I think there's going to be that novelty. Yeah, I think people will listen to the show or whatever your preferred podcast or TV show or whatever because you want to hear about what the hosts have to say about your team. If it's after a big win, if it's after a big loss, and you're able to stomach that conversation about, your team blowing a game late or something like that, you still get that like sense of listening to a conversation about your team. But I think the drop-off still comes from people who, A, feel like their season is hopeless, or B, I don't like Dan. Dan has gotten on my nerves. I tried for 6 weeks, for 9 weeks to see if he could turn it around, but I'm just not a Dan guy. Ty seems handsome and witty, but I'm not a Dan guy. So those are the people who drop off in my view.
I love the people that get us mixed up, by the way.
Yeah.
That's my favorite.
I don't even need glasses. There's not even a prescription in these bad boys, but because we're both handsome dudes with dark hair, I feel like I had to differentiate. Yeah.
Here's another topic that comes up often when I'm talking with the folks out in the great land.
Across this great state, I'm talking to real college football fans.
That's right.
Yeah.
I get it's not so much a question, it's more of a rhetorical question or comment. What are we going to do about transfer portal? What are we going to do about
out
players?
Of control?
Out of control. What are we going to do about these players getting paid? Which, of course, is a loaded question. It's not even really a question. And most of the time when I get that, you kind of know right out of the chute where the person is coming from with that statement. They're not in favor of it.
Right.
I've really struggled with that.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest here with everybody, I've really struggled with explaining that in a way that isn't completely off-putting.
Right.
And that doesn't mean I'm using like profanity, but it does mean that I don't think there's a good way to sugarcoat it. I think it is a good thing for the players. I think the players are long overdue to get their fair share. This has been in the works for a while. It has obviously accelerated. It has changed the game, maybe more so than any of the structural stuff that you and I have just described.
Yeah.
Players being able to get money in tandem with them being able to move about freely is truly the biggest earthquake we've seen in this sport in a good long time.
Mm-hmm.
So I truly believe that. I think you and I are like-minded in that respect. We believe they are certainly within their right to be paid and be compensated and get some slice of the pie.
Which is both dipping into the NIL question and the portal question, but yes.
Exactly. So I think we believe that. Where I struggle, though, is there a way to kind of bring this into balance? Is there a way to bring this into balance where it's not, just use Ohio State as an example, where it's not just the teams with the most money that are buying off the best players and the rest of the sport is going to suffer. Like, we get the question often about the Super League.
Mm-hmm.
What will it take, or is it possible that we have a Super League of 20 of 40 teams in college football? I don't know if that's ever going to happen. I'm skeptical that it will. But for all intents and purposes, if you've only got a handful of programs that have all the money and start buying off the best players, don't you kind of create that informally anyway?
Sure.
I struggle with how to explain that to people as both a good thing for the players as well as a good thing for the sport long term. I've never had a good answer to that question. Maybe you're different than me.
Right.
You're more eloquent with your speech and better at explaining these complicated concepts. In my pea brain, I cannot figure out a good way to explain that doesn't turn people away.
Okay, so I can help because I have this conversation a lot like you do. And here's what I have found when talking to some folks across this great state, Ty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nobody likes the transfer portal.
No, they don't.
Nobody likes the
They hate
transfer
it.
portal.
Everybody hates
In
it.
terms of college football fans, or in terms of sports fans who tune in for big games or who like watching their alma mater but don't stay locked into the sport's rhythms, the sine wave of the sport. I took enough math to know what a sine wave is. I didn't take a ton of math, Ty.
That's the extent of my sine wave knowledge. Continue.
Went to a state school, never took calculus, did okay in AP Stat. Some people call it stats. I think we had this conversation many moons ago. But nobody likes the transfer portal. Now, when you say it's good for the players, the issue I would take with that is I think it's good for some players.
It's good for some players. Yeah, that's fair.
I think
that's
it's
fair, Dan.
depending on who you are as a player.
Yeah.
That is meaningful.
There's a lot of false promises out there too in the transfer portal. And that's where being smart and having smart associates and people around you, a good supportive team around you can really pay some dividends because, yeah, I mean, look, there's already plenty of examples of guys going in the portal, maybe being promised riches or maybe just playing time.
Right.
And it's been a bit of a coin flip, frankly. They don't all work out. And at least in that aspect, yeah, it's not good for every player.
Right. So nobody likes the transfer portal, and that there's the asterisk. The asterisk is basically like, yes, if you root for a team that has a ton of money that succeeds more than fails in terms of building a roster through the portal or addressing needs through the portal, I, as an Oregon fan, have seen Oregon use the portal to great effect, great success. You, as a Notre Dame fan, similar. Michigan didn't win a national championship because of it, but they certainly plugged holes and created depth with quality guys on the offensive line, on defense. Like, they did a great job addressing needs and building depth and ended up winning a national championship, at least partly because of it. But even Michigan fans, even Oregon fans, even Notre Dame fans, whoever, Ole Miss fans who've succeeded wildly, Florida State fans, like, they'll say, yeah, it's great, we got these guys, but it doesn't seem like a fun way to have a sport. And I understand why when we say some players, right, that like if you are suddenly an all-conference player who is making no money and has an opportunity to dramatically change your bank account by going elsewhere because of what you've accomplished, and you don't feel like your school has the means or has the desire or whatever, they're happy to have you below market rate. Whatever. Like, yeah, that's a great thing for that specific player. But for the sport, having like these dramatic swings in quality for teams and losing track of who's where, whether you're a regional fan, specific only to a team, watching some national games that, like, you and I were having a conversation about what Big Ten quarterbacks, and we mentioned Gavin Wimsatt at Rutgers a couple weeks ago, and we both whiffed, and forgetting that Gavin Wimsatt is now going to be like a backup at Kentucky.
Right.
Like, okay, like all we do is pay attention to this sport every day, all year long.
Dan, I watched that Rutgers spring game
the
full way through, or at least whatever was available online. I watched it start to finish, everything I could find, because we did a show about it.
Yeah.
We talked about Gavin Wimsatt.
Yeah.
I'll be the first to admit, I whiffed too. I totally whiffed. I had no idea he went to Kentucky. There's too much that's changing. And to your point that you've made for so long as well, like so much of what you said over the years, I feel like has come true to your credit. It's a hard sport to get into. It's a hard sport to just sort of happen upon and get into because so much is changing every year. Not the least of which is all the structural BS that we've been discussing here, but players changing teams so readily in the offseason. In some cases where people like you and I don't even detect it. That's really hard to keep track of and really hard to be a fan of, and develop any kind of loyalty. It becomes very transactional.
I find myself telling fans of teams about their new transfers because they were unaware. I have had conversations with a Wisconsin fan, and they'll be like, man, they were so shaky at quarterback. What do you think this year? Like, are these guys going to get better? One, not knowing Tanner Mordecai's gone. Two, not knowing TVD came in from Miami. And so fans of their own team, and these are very specific examples. I'm not saying Wisconsin fans are not following Wisconsin football, but I'm just saying this has happened for multiple, team people that root for teams but don't pay attention between January and August. Maybe they pick up a magazine, maybe they listen to a podcast, maybe they come across something in a newspaper, website, whatever, and then they learn that Miami's quarterback transferred in and had a good stretch in 2021 or whatever. So that to me is sort of the difficulty with the portal is it makes it more difficult to be a fan. You have to lock in so much more often. And it's not a horrible problem to have if you're a fan of whatever team, of Washington State or Cal or something. But there's a disconnect that I don't think existed. And college football is, to me, driven so much by like my identity is tied in with my history as a Notre Dame fan, my history as a Florida fan or whatever. And if players are coming and going, then it feels more than ever like you're rooting for laundry. That you're just like, oh, now this Arkansas dude is the safety and this South Carolina State guy is playing right tackle. And it feels as if your team is more of a vehicle than a place. And that's a bummer to, I think, a lot of people. Again, my experience may not be your experience, and I'm speaking to listeners right now that like, no, that's not my experience at all. That's not the experience of me and my friends. And for that, yeah, that's totally possible. But in my experience, the transfer portal has an approval rating of about 3%. Nate Silver is very worried about transfer portal's polling right now.
It's got the lowest Q rating in the world right now.
And maybe that's because college football is inherently pretty anti-player, right? Because we root for institutions. Like, that's what we do in the sport. We're not, fans of like the 1998 team specifically because we love the defensive line. We're a fan of Nebraska.
Yeah, this isn't the NBA where you root for personality.
You see faces. You're on your team for 9 years or whatever. So it's a sport that's at its core, you're rooting for institutions. And I think this just emphasizes that more. And that's sad because I think the idea of rooting for players and, following along with the player's journey from like a special teamer to a rotation guy to a starter for a couple years, like that helped form a lot of people. So I hold conflicting views that like,
yeah, me too.
I am for the ability for players to find a better fit for themselves, both competitively and financially. But like overwhelmingly, I have to listen to people who like the sport who say this makes it less fun. And so,
yeah,
I don't know what the long-term solution is going to be beyond like getting things down on paper, right? Getting, contracts and employment and everything like that to sort of normalize or optimize, whatever the word is, the idea of we like players who stick around that we get to know, and that's sort of the trade-off for the money.
I'm glad you brought that up. There is one tentacle of this that I do believe can be reasonably solved.
Okay.
And it is not mass player movement, but maybe the only thing that has a lower Q rating than the transfer portal is bowl opt-outs.
Sure.
People hate bowl opt-outs. They hate it. Even though the bowl games are exhibition games, there is this sense that it's even more of a meaningless exhibition game than before because so many of the players are not playing in it.
Yeah.
People have real resentment towards that right now as a thing that players can do. I think the irony is that in order for that to be solved, we almost have to go further down the path of player compensation, further down the path of, as you said, putting it down on paper, further down the path of there being even more money available to players. What I think happens in due time and why I think they can and will solve this at some point in the future. I'm not saying this year or next year, but
I think a lot of this is going to be solved, by the way. I'm very optimistic. I don't know what it means for TV ratings, but continue. I'm optimistic that a lot of what ails college football in terms of perception, can be solved.
I think the bowl opt-outs thing can be, because if we come to a point in time, and it seems like we're gonna, where players get a slice of that TV revenue, a slice of that pie, where some of the NIL infrastructure is not being governed by a third party, but instead by athletic departments and the institutions themselves.
Yeah.
As some qualifier, as some part of signing on with a program, there will have to be contracts if there is money involved. There already sort of is a contract. That's what a letter of intent is. But this is different to a new level if we're talking about actual finances.
Right.
And
there's no like specific standard across the sport.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as part of those agreements, which I'm sure will be vetted by very smart lawyers, neither you nor I are lawyers here. We have no idea what we're talking about. But if there's money involved, clearly there will be lawyers involved that are overseeing the process so that everything hopefully is done on the up and up.
Yeah.
And I got to believe that as part of those agreements, there will be language in there that keeps guys playing in bowl games, that some portion of their revenue will be contingent on bowl participation.
And look, a bigger playoff means that there is just going to be more competitive reasons to keep playing because you feel as if you want to win a national championship or you want to play on that stage. Even if you think you're like, yeah, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be a first or second round pick, by me performing in a huge way at Penn State, at Miami, at Texas, whatever, with more eyeballs than ever watching, that like I have an opportunity to either cement that or make a leap in people's eyes because of the level of competition I can show out against. Yeah.
I believe that the bowl opt-outs thing is solvable. I don't know if it's solvable yet. I think we'll still see a fair share of that. I also think it's only a matter of time until we have a threat of a playoff opt-out.
Everything that can happen will happen.
It will happen. It will happen. These things will happen, and I think some aspect of the opt-outs can be resolved in due time.
Yeah.
And so I'm optimistic on that.
I think there will be more at play, though. I don't know that we're going to see a lot of opt-outs in a 12 or 14 team playoff that are just like, I want to preserve myself physically. I think it'll be more, I am already pretty injured, and it doesn't seem worth it to jeopardize what I might have in the future. Or I hate being in this locker room playing for these coaches. I've grown to just hate my existence in whatever college town, in whatever culture, locker room, whatever. Like I just see no reason to continue longer than I need to for my future, for my happiness or whatever. That'll happen. And maybe we won't get the whole story and that person will become a villain because we don't know the whole story. But yes, anything that can happen will happen.
One other thing for me, and then if you've got any other points that you want to bring up, you can go for it. One other common question that I've gotten on more than one occasion, the whole Nick Sabin retirement thing, I think could have a really interesting effect on this season.
Are you going to do the Saddam vacuum thing?
A little bit.
Okay.
A little bit. Sabin retiring really does leave a pretty big vacuum in the sport. And they replaced him with Kalen DeBoer, who was already one of the best coaches in college football, albeit he hasn't been a head coach for all that long at the Power 5 level, but obviously has proven that he knows what he's doing. I don't think if you're out there rooting for Alabama to take a major step back, you're going to be waiting a while. I think they're going to be fine. But it does create something of a void, not having Sabin in college football. And the thought that was expressed to me was that college football is more enjoyable now without Sabin.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if I fully agree with, but I do understand where people are coming from when they bring that up, because much like we've seen in other sports with dynasties, after a while, sure, you appreciate the greatness, but also you're sort of ready for that novelty. You're ready to fall back in love with the sport and have somebody else step up and claim that mantle. And with Sabin retiring, we've talked about it all offseason. What kind of effect is that going to have on the SEC? What kind of effect is that going to have on college football as a whole? And I hadn't really considered what kind of effect that might have on college football fandom. I feel like so much has changed over the last 6 months even. that Sabin leaving at this point is almost an afterthought. It won't be once the season gets here. Every announcer and everybody writing about college football or doing what we do is going to talk about it because we have to. Next month when we do previews, we're going to have to talk about Sabin and what the new version of Bama and the Southeastern Conference looks like without him. That's just the reality that we live in.
Yeah.
But the effect that it might have on fandom, more people out there being interested in SEC and in college football as a whole, because the biggest titan of the sport, the best coach in the history of the sport, is no longer there. That was a zag I did not expect, Dan.
Yeah, I think at least in the short term, people are not really going to know what to expect if you're a fan of somebody else, but like number 7 Alabama's playing number 9 Georgia or something, that like it doesn't become as much of an obvious TV show without Nick Saban. Whether you like rooting for him or you're just curious to see what this year's, you know that Alabama is going to have some sort of dynastic squad in some way because that's all they've produced pretty much through the last, 15 years.
And there were a lot of people. I mean, Bama games had high ratings. And part of the reason why they had the ratings is because there were a lot of people who would hate watch.
Yeah.
What's it going to mean this year if you're not hate watching Alabama?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the sentiment that I think I'm trying to get to, or that's at least been expressed to me. Honestly, I had not considered that aspect of it. I considered everything else, just not that.
Well, and the meaning of beating Alabama changes.
It does.
Right?
Absolutely.
Like the meaning of beating Kalen DeBoer, Alabama, even if he goes 10-2 every season for the entirety of his regular season career at Alabama, beating Kalen DeBoer, Alabama is never going to be beating Nick Saban, Alabama. And just in terms of setting an SEC or a national narrative, it's a little bit of David Lee Roth, Sammy Hagar. Like you saw Van Halen, but which Van Halen?
Yeah.
Right? That's a reference for the old people out there.
For the olds, yeah, that's right.
There's just, you have to be more specific about what, you beat Jim Harbaugh, Michigan, or you beat Sharon Moore, Michigan. Sharon Moore might be incredible, but there was a certain amount of hate or appreciation or even just knowledge and recognition of Jim Harbaugh at Michigan and just as a football coach where you're just like, oh, I know what I'm going to get on the sideline for as long as this person is coaching there. And yeah, everything changes. And when I say like I'm optimistic that the issues that your transfer portal has, the issues that NIL has, the issues that an expanded playoff, the issues that realignment has, this is not a sport that makes a decision and sticks with it for 30 years. No. It has never been that. No. And so I don't know what like a comparison, an apt analogy would be, but some of it's dating, right? You date somebody for a couple months, you're like, I don't know if I want to be with somebody long-term who is 6'6", or that loud, or this religion, or this messy, or drinks this much, or drinks this little, whatever. And you just sort of find what works for you, and you're always tinkering. And that's what the sport is. That's what, if people keep getting turned off and we keep having these tangible effects that like Chip Kelly goes from being the head coach at a major place to an offensive coordinator, and Jeff Hafley and Kane Wommack, all these different experiences that these guys are having in reaction to the reality of where the sport is, the sport will adjust. I think the sport is going to recognize that perhaps, and I use this like the sport, but I think conferences and commissioners are going to come to the realization that certain things that they've done have turned off too many people. And it's not that they're going to move backwards and we're going to go to the BCS or something like that, but I think there will be incremental changes over the next few years in response to negativity surrounding the sport. So whether that is re-regionalizing the way teams are grouped together, or the way, like, I don't know how backwards the playoff could go, but I think we could see it, hop back from 14 to 12 or to 8 or something like that. If you keep seeing lesser and lesser TV ratings against the NFL in late December, like there are tangible ways to measure the success of the sport. And I think the people that run the sport aren't dumb, and they're not going to expand, and they're not going to try and grow the bottom line at the expense of long-term thinking forever. And so however you want to compare it, I do believe that people running the sport at some point are going to recognize that running certain aspects into the ground are going to kill it. And so I'm optimistic that people are not that stupid.
Well, you can only expand so much further.
That's true.
And there are a limited amount of dollars out there. This is not an infinite sum of money. At some point, you reach kind of a terminal velocity with all this. And I don't know when that point arrives. I don't know with these conversations that we've had about private equity and these other sources of revenue that programs are apparently investigating. Seems like they're all investigating it on some level.
Yeah.
I don't know what that does to that equation, but certainly this is not something that can expand forever. Right now, they're trying to make this as strong of a business case as they can with as much money available to all parties. And that's fine. At some point, though, I think there will be more of a strategic conversation about where is this headed.
And unfortunately, the most obvious place of like unbundling is, hey guys, we're going to have 28 Big Ten teams and 28 SEC teams. And it's going to be the NFC and AFC, and we're going to go from there. That's probably the great bundling and unbundling at the same time. But also, I think there is going to be a reckoning. I really do think there's going to be reckoning with the direction of the sport. And there is going to be, despite 150 years of evidence to the contrary, there is going to be some sort of leadership at the top that doesn't exist right now, that is going to get a boardroom of some kind together with all of the conferences, and they're going to come to conclusions that will benefit the health of the sport. I think.
Yeah, I think it a little bit like Lord of the Rings, the first Lord of the Rings, where they gather around and figure out what they're going to do next.
Yeah.
In some cases, warring factions trying to get on the same side. I mean, it may take something like that to preserve the long-term health of the sport. It's kind of hard to foresee that right now. I don't think that leadership exists, but at some point, if the money dries up at least a little bit, or if at least the availability of money, let's say, more accurately is what dries up, at some point they'll have to think longer term about it.
Is there an event? Is there a specific event that you think would cause dramatic change? Or like, is there an optic? Is there something in your mind that you're like, wow, college football has gotten to this point and it's so bad that they're all going to huddle up in some sort of Hyatt place in Texas and figure out where it went wrong and how to get back on the right track? Is there like that specific event to you?
I think a very, very small example of that occurring right now is what's happening at Colorado with Deion and the over-reliance of the transfer portal. You know, can you imagine if that works? Can you imagine if we're 5 years down the line, Deion builds a roster every year out of the transfer portal, steals everybody's best players? There would be.
He hasn't started doing that yet.
He hasn't started doing it yet, but I'm saying if we're doing this thought experiment,
right?
I think it will take something like that, something radical like that, that will force everybody to get in a room and think about, is this what we want? Some people will come at it from the perspective of, we feel it's a competitive unbalance that we need to try and rectify. Others will come at it from the standpoint of, hey, we want to try this too. But I think it'll take something radical like that. Like if there is, let's say, an injection of private equity into a school like a Florida State, and suddenly they can go out and pay all their players $10 million, which won't happen. I know this is an exaggeration, but instances like that, I think, would be the kind of thing that force people to sit down in a room and like, hold up, let's see where we really want to take this, and is this fair for everybody?
Yeah, I think it's going to be programs shutting down.
Shutting down
financially. I mean, you remember during COVID when there were announcements across the college sports landscape that this school has just canceled four sports for the foreseeable future or forever, whatever. I think, that like Cal and Wake Forest have just decided they can't compete, and instead of throwing money at the problem that doesn't do anything, they're shutting football down. Or, some school that has had a ton of success, but not lately, they're just like, we're done. We're going to, destroy the stadium and, build a golf course.
It has to be, the caveat is, it has to be a program that a lot of people care about.
Yeah.
And I mean no disrespect to Vanderbilt to Rutgers, when I say this, they are very frequently the punching bags for this conversation.
Yeah.
But you know as well as I, we hear about it all the time. We won't talk about it as much on this episode, maybe another one. One other thing we get a lot of is, hey, when are they going to kick Rutgers out? When are they going to kick Vanderbilt out of the SEC with all the money on the line? Couldn't they give that spot to a better team? If it's a program at some point that a lot of people care about, or that is very prominent in the national conversation, if they're unable to remain solvent because of this new world order, that would turn some heads.
They don't want to take private equity money, and it goes south, and the stands are empty. Like, what if the stands are empty at playoff games? I mean, we're already going to have playoff games with school not in session, and at a number of places that doesn't matter. But you do lose something, right? I think finals are in generally early to mid-December, and the playoff starts like around the 19th or 20th most seasons, it looks like. So you're going to have limited students at games. If the weather's terrible somewhere and 10,000 people don't show up, and you get people posting pictures of like semi-empty playoff games, national championships that people don't want to go to, whatever, I think that could be a sort of impetus.
There's a lot of travel.
That meeting.
There's a lot of travel involved. If you're a fan of a team, you have to decide if you want to, in many cases, spend the money to go to a first round matchup on campus. If you want to sell out and try to go to one of the quarter or semifinals,
that's on a Wednesday night.
On a Wednesday night, held at like the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl or something. Yeah. Or if you want to try and delay it even further and try to go to a national championship or something like that. I mean, it's a decision for a lot of people trying to figure out what makes the most sense.
Yeah, I think ultimately the thing that's funding the sport right now, TV, is going to be the biggest barometer. That if they're just absolutely shelled ratings-wise, and there's just the conversation shifts away from college football in late December, early January. You've got NFL, NBA, all sorts of stuff happening at this time, and the conversation around the sport and viewership across the sport is just like, I mean, I think the Oregon-Ohio State game had something like 18.1 was the rating or something like that, and TCU Georgia was in like the 8s or 9s, something like that. Like, if you get that sort of low number constantly, and I know they're adding volume to try to make it up in impressions and everything for advertisers, but like, it's not going to be a sensible solution if people aren't watching.
Well, I think
just not.
I think round one on campus will get a ton of action.
Yeah.
I think that will, over the long haul, be the round that gets the most interest from the public. Not just because there are more games and more teams, but I think the allure of having those games on campus is something that is very, very integral to the sport. It's meaningful to those of us who have rooted for the sport for a long time, having those games on campus. I think we'll see that reflected in the numbers, but the deeper you go into this thing, I'm curious too.
Do you think I'm being too precious in saying that like college football will find a way? Too romantic?
Yes.
Really?
I don't trust these guys, Dan.
Yeah.
They've not really given us a great reason to trust that they're going to do what's best for the sport in the long term.
Yeah.
And at least if the current trend holds, it's the pursuit of the dollar as opposed to the betterment of the game.
Yeah.
And I am not a pessimistic person with respect to college football. I'm going to watch regardless. I'm going to find the fun stuff to talk about on this show. It's just what we do. We're not going to take a doom and gloom approach. We're not going to take an I told you so approach to any of this. Where we're right, where we're wrong, more often than not, we'll be wrong.
Yeah.
That's just not who we are. But until they give me a reason to believe that they are trustworthy and they are not just going out after the almighty dollar, I have no reason to think otherwise.
Yeah. So you're more doomer with this than I am, weirdly enough.
I am more doomer with respect to the powers that be. Because there's never been a centralized governing body here to kind of keep this thing on the rails. You've got a lot of folks operating, operating
across this great state
in their own best interest.
Yeah.
And until there is some sort of event or some reason for them to work a little bit more together and not try to get as rich as possible, I'm not as optimistic that all of these things will be solved. I think some of it will kind of come out in the wash. I think some of it will be solved the deeper we get into this new structure with money and contracts and expanded playoff and like some of it will kind of work itself out. But if we're talking about ultimately trying to make the sport as fun as it can be, as equitable as it can be, as sustainable as possible, I have not seen much evidence that anybody's interested in that right now.
Well, here, you know, an interesting canary is for canary in the coal mine type situation is, what do Washington State and Oregon State games look like in terms of the people there? What do the crowds look like? What do the TV ratings look like? What do the conversations look like? And not just early on, but later on in the season, especially if one of those teams is like an 8-4-ish type team. Do we see catastrophic downturns? Do we see surprising like rallying behind these teams who definitely feel like they've been wronged by the sport and by the other teams in their region? Like, that to me will go a long way as for explaining the true love people either do or don't have for their teams, regardless of the state of the sport.
So look, Dan, we do shows like this from time to time where we're not playing a game, where it's just stuff that's on our mind, and we feel the need to talk it out and have a conversation. Yeah. If you have made it this full way through, if you found this conversation valuable and meaningful, and
tweet
at least
the following sentence at Tony Barnhart. No.
No. We're not doing a secret verbal here.
Not a secret verbal. Okay.
No secret verbal. We'll save that for the season. If any of this has been thought-provoking for you, hit follow or subscribe on the podcast. Hang with us all season long. Things will start to roll a little bit more downhill the closer we get to everything. But for the time being anyway, these are the types of conversations that Dan and I have been having with people who just find, oh, you talk about college football for a living? What about this? What about that? There have been some common themes. We obviously would love to hear from you as well. So whether you email in solidverbal@gmail.com, whether you hit us up on social media, comment on YouTube videos, wherever you can post, we would welcome your feedback on any of the stuff we described here today. Let us know where we're right, where we're wrong, and maybe stuff we should talk about next time around, because there will be a next time around. This is just the state of being right now.
Whether or not you feel like Boone Pickens Stadium will be turned into like a Spirit of Halloween store.
That's right.
Or
That's
not.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. All right. Again, verballers.com is where you can go if you want to join the community. We've got a teeming community of college football fans ever so interested in this coming college football season, talking feverishly on our Discord server about any and all things, not just college football, but sports and life in general. Verballers.com is where you can go to check that out. You also get bonus episodes, ad-free episodes. If nothing more, you can help support what Dan and I do. For the last time, hit follow, hit subscribe if you like what you heard here today and you want more of it in your podcasting feed of choice. Dan, that's all I got, man.
Yeah, it's everything I have.
For that guy over there, my good friend Dan Rubenstein, for myself, Ty Hildenbrandt, thank you for downloading, for listening, for supporting. We will talk to you all on Thursday. In the meantime, stay solid.
Peace.